We're back with some poems and thoughts on giving my word for August First Thursday, which is titled "Out Through the Garden." In Omaha, we are deep into the summer and at that tipping point in gardening. The early fruits of anticipation have turned into avalanches, especially the beans and cucumbers and tomatoes. I am a gardener. I have been gardening since I was 5, missing only a few years in the course of my life. In my retirement, when I'm asked what do I do with my time, I reply, I write and I garden. Given the fact that this coming Saturday, I will say goodbye to my 83rd year, that's a lot of gardening. These gardens have acquired a great deal of tradition. I would have thought that I would be recording this in the garden, but gardens are hard to catch the moment. The garden that started out in a drought is now so wet that one could hardly step into it at 2.5 inches of rain in the last 24 hours. Suffice it for me to simply say that out front, the phlox are from my mother's garden transplanted from Iowa. And across the drive is the golden glow brought from my grandmother in Vermont's farm. The peppers and tomatoes out back are planted in a way my father taught me, and with some modifications and changes along the way, which means that they are the occasion of some talk back. The present garden is a maybe garden, as in maybe the last. Still, in the garden, it is not uncommon to hear one say, next year when I plant this. These reflections have produced a poem which you will find on page 76, entitled Out Through the Garden. Is it in a sense a death wish, but not morbid, but rather playful? Out through the garden. Honey, I said, I'm going out to the garden. She misses the humor in my remark, or more likely, she has chosen to ignore it. To me, she is a little too much of the world that doesn't keep track of the score. Once it was common to speak of the score, as in 70 and 70. But now to speak of a score is either comic or contrived. Somewhere along the line, the score has disappeared. I suppose it was when the mechanics took over keeping the time. And as a result, we have become experts on minutes and seconds, but no longer seem to know the score. With that unspoken thought, I'm out the door, intent on losing myself in the garden, and think as I go, I should at least say to her, you come too. That last line echoes Robert Frost's poem from The Pasture, which is also echoed in the poem earlier on Giving My Word, The Journey of the Mind to Ultimate Smallness and Back, page 22. Robert Frost's poetry is part of my formation and is never far from my experience of life. The appeal of a garden is not simply its produce, but the way a garden takes one out of the determinate structures of daily existence. Time in our daily existence is mechanistic, a matter of minutes and hours, but time in a garden is tuned to life. Time in the garden demands that one step back and wait. It fills one with anticipation, requires one to make constant adjustments, a little more water, a shot of fertilizer, and to keep vigilance to catch that moment between not yet ripe and overripe. The present time gives way to an ancient sense of time, which led me to write a poem which I've called A Brief History of Gardens, page 77. Some references may help you in hearing this poem. Milton's Paradise Lost, Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthless Delights, and Voltaire's Candide, its last final line. The argument of the poem is that gardening is part of the narrative that constitutes our being personally, nationally, and spiritually, which are explored in On Giving My Word. A brief history of gardens. The first garden was Eden, which was planted by God. It was, of course, perfect, except it appears to have been a little viney, for Milton alleges that Eve on that fearful day went off by herself to arrange those profligate vines, and thereby incurred in her head that buzz which apparently said, "You can know the difference between good and evil, ever much as God himself." Adam's garden was filled with weeds, and its fruits were garnered in by the sweat of his brow. Daily he coaxed from the earth the bread of life, and daily the earth whispered back to him, "I'll bury you." Did he not? He did not doubt that it would be true, but for all that, loved it nonetheless. There followed in time the Garden of Earthly Delights, painted by Hieronymus Bosch with unparalleled insight. Lushly fruited with contrivances never before seen or since, centered on a lucid watering hole, around which parades a plethora of fauna, and danced a multitude of male and females, splayed about in extravagant mirth, all of which was hinged between a pristine time before and a very dark time after. Voltaire's garden was an idea in his mind, which he commended to all. Il faut cultiver notre jardin. By Jefferson, it was made into a virtual laboratory, testing 330 kinds of vegetables and 170 varieties of fruit, all meticulously noted for yield, over against time and circumstances, and assiduously cared for by the tireless Wormley Hughes, Jefferson's manslave. My father's garden was driven, one might say, from leftover fear, from gardening on a Vermont subsistence farm, where he was raised in poverty with 10 siblings. It was overplanted with potatoes, tomatoes, and beans in order to stock a root cellar, and to fill jars put up by my mother and tidily shelved in our basement, never fully consumed. The tending of it fell to us children and was accompanied with lectures. The Irish poor in Boston had rickets. The even poorer Italians had none because they grew and they ate green peppers. His garden was out of proportion to our progressive entrance into middle-class life. But as with the green peppers, it was to remind us that in regard to middle-class life, we were to remain outliers. In this oversized garden, which often got the best of us, as gardens do, there was a plot about 6 by 6, if I remember right, which was my garden, which I could plant as I like as a kind of descent. And I suppose that is why through a number of moves and changes of my life, that garden continues to grow in my own backyard. My garden in all of its permutations is filled with memories. When I mulched my asparagus, I remember my German grandmother, whose asparagus bed lay just outside of the chicken pen. I am still trying to equal it and think my disadvantage lies in the lack of a hen. When my spade turns earth, I remember my Italian grandmother, who at 80 rebelled against being confined to a kitchen garden by spading her own. When I plant green peppers, I remember my father's lectures on how the poor Italians didn't have rickets. When I pick gooseberries, I remember my mother's anguish at debearding each one for such a modest, sour return. When I weed my beans, I remember my little brother lying down in the row in order to watch them grow. In fact, my garden is a book in which my life can be read. Christ's garden was Gethsemane. Its most precious fruit were the drops of his blood that fell from his most sacred brow. Is this then the last garden in which we will sow before the toe takes us down and under? With that, I'd like to finish with one other poem that comes in this section of On Giving My Word. Its title is I Slept in the Garden. I slept in the garden when they led you past. I looked away. Now lying under the cross on a bed of rock, I should like to taste the flaming air drawn down into your drowning lungs, made large by your feet pushing against the nails, and by the pull of your arms on the crossbar above, lasting no more than a fleeting second, a draught begun with relish and half drunk before falling into the dark. But when we return for First Thursday in September, our selections from On Giving My Word will represent the fact that September is a month marked by the great Jewish high holidays, Sukkot, Yom Kippur, and Rosh Hashanah. We will feature poems and thoughts in On Giving My Word that reflect on the relationship of Christianity and Judaism.